Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to address you on this occasion as Chairman of the IPCC. I'm happy to report to you that the fourth assessment report of the IPCC has been completed with the release of the synthesis report in Valencia, Spain on the 16th of November this year. The synthesis report brings out the collective findings of the three working group reports within an integrated framework, and therefore I would submit this is an extremely policy relevant document, and I hope all of you have copies of it, particularly the summary for policymakers. Let me highlight some of the major findings of the synthesis report and the entire AR4 or fourth assessment report as a whole. I would like to reiterate the finding that came out of the Working Group 1 report, namely that the warming of the capital system is unequivocal. And you can see the extent of warming, changes in sea level, and of course the melting of ice cover in the northern hemisphere in the figure that's projected before you. Undoubtedly, there have been periods in the past when we've had changes in capital warming followed by cooling and so on, but the last 40 or 50 years have been very significant in terms of the extent of warming that is now well recorded and well established. For instance, from 1900 to 2005, precipitation increased significantly in eastern parts of North and South America, Northern Europe, and Northern and Central Asia, but it declined in the Sahel, the Mediterranean, Southern Africa, and parts of Southern Asia. We also know that the area affected by drought has increased significantly since the 1970s. We have examined a number of scenarios of economic growth and development and socio-economic changes, and we find that at the lower end of the scenarios, the best estimate for increase of temperature that we come up with by the end of this century is 1.8 degrees Celsius. At the upper end of the scenarios, the best estimate that we come up with is 4 degrees Celsius. This, combined with the increase in temperature that took place during the 20th century of 0.74 degrees Celsius, gives us a total of temperature increase since the beginning of the last century of at least 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. Now that clearly is something to worry about. If you look at the diagram indicating the relationship between temperature increase and the impacts on specific sectors, as far as water resources are concerned, we've already entered a region of temperature increase which will create scarcity of water in several parts of the world. If we look at ecosystems, then you would observe that even with a temperature increase of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, then we would get possibly a danger or threat of extinction of about 20 to 30% of the species that have been assessed by us. Now, I would like to raise some issues which impact on equity considerations as far as the impacts of capitalists are concerned. If we look at Africa, for instance, we find that by 2020, something like 75 to 250 million people are likely to be affected by water stress. And this, we must remember, is a continent where in several regions, water scarcity is already beginning to have a major impact on social and economic conditions. We also have projected that by 2020, in the rain-fed areas of Africa, there could be a decline in productivity of crops by up to 50%. In the case of Asia, we would find that there are areas which are highly vulnerable to coastal flooding, and this includes particularly the mega deltas such as Kolkata, Shanghai, Dhaka, and other cities. If you look at the map which shows the various locations where coastal flooding and the impacts of sea level rise could make certain areas highly vulnerable, then you would see that these particular locations are spread all over the world. Finally, let me turn to the situation in the small island states, which are going to be extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. And as a matter of fact, in several of these small island states, the water length, that means this is the water that exists within the core of the island that is potable, this will actually shrink. And in some parts of the world, this will probably reach a level where there's no fresh water available, requiring large quantities of desalination. What I would like to convey to this distinguished audience is that all of this can be avoided or minimized if we take effective actions for mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases. And I'd like to also emphasize the fact that the cost of mitigation is really not all that high. We have assessed several scenarios for stabilizing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which will lead to a certain corresponding level of maximum increase in temperatures. If we are to stabilize the temperature increase to a maximum of 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, then we would have to ensure that the concentration of greenhouse gases is stabilized between 445 to 490 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. Now at that level, the cost of meeting this kind of target by 2030 will be no more than 3% of the global GDP in that particular year. And this amounts to 0.12% in decrease in GDP from now up to that period. This is really not a very high price to pay, because all this means is that the level of prosperity that we would reach in 2030 would at best be postponed by a year or less. And in fact, if we adopt policies by which new technologies are developed, then this cost could actually come down significantly. Now, there are two other facts that I'd like to mention in association with this particular scenario. If we were to stabilize at this level, then we really have a very short window of opportunity. Then it's absolutely essential that emissions are allowed to increase at the latest by 2015, beyond which they have to decline. And the sharper the decline, the less would be the serious impacts that follow over a period of time. But I also want to emphasize another fact that is associated with this particular scenario. If we were to stabilize at that level, then unfortunately there is so much momentum in the warming of the oceans that by thermal expansion alone, the oceans will see an increase in level by anywhere from 0.4 to 1.4 meters at equilibrium. Now, this is not necessarily going to take place in the 21st century. It would perhaps spill over to much later periods. But I think we have to accept that even at this level of stabilization and temperature increase, we are committing the world to sea level rise of 0.4 to 1.4 meters, which is quite serious as far as the small island states and low coastal areas are concerned. And to this, if we were to add the impacts of glaciers melting, of the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet melting very rapidly or collapsing, then clearly we are adding to this a dimension that perhaps we wouldn't really want to see in the future. Now, what I would like to submit is that we need to balance the increase in temperatures and the associated impacts, which obviously are going to be disastrous in some cases, with the cost of mitigation. Then clearly prudence, wisdom, and the future of the human society clearly dictate that we have to take in hand mitigation measures with a great sense of urgency. And these measures will have to be accompanied by policy changes and perhaps even changes in lifestyles and human behavior. Now, these policy changes will clearly have to target a number of measures, but one of them that's going to be absolutely crucial is placing a price on carbon. If we place a price on carbon, then that will spur development of technologies, it will spur the dissemination of technologies by which we might be able to save different parts of the world from some of the more serious impacts of climate change that otherwise we would encounter. In conclusion, let me say that we have placed before you the findings of the IPCC synthesis report and the entire fourth assessment report. It is for this enlightened community to decide what they want to do with these findings. We clearly need to assure the world that we are fully cognizant of the risks associated with capitalism if it is not mitigated, and therefore we should assure our constituencies and people at large across this planet that we have decided to safeguard our future and that we're going to take action firmly and urgently to see that the capital of this earth is stabilized as early as possible at a level that we can all accept and live with without any threat in the future. Thank you very much.